Welcome, welcome, welcome. How are you guys doing? It looks like I made a tiny mistake today, which was that I put this live stream up accidentally, not unlisted on our YouTube channel. So some of you might be here who are not in the mastering course. And if so, you're getting a sneak preview of what goes on in the mastering course. So very cool. Welcome to those few of you who were able to join us at this unlisted link. You're in here, and hopefully you'll enjoy the sneak peek of one of the live Q&As that are part of Mastering Demystified. Great to have you guys here. Some familiar faces. Danielle is joining us again from Nitrosonic Studios in Kentucky. Remind me, you're in Lexington, right? Is it Lexington or Louisville? Sebastian, always good to see you here. Some more familiar names and faces here. And some new ones too. SSM Studio, good to see you. Andre, good to see you. All right. So a quick question for you. Who here has been to one of these Q&As before? Tell me if you've been to one of these before. And let me know if this is your first one. And write to us down in the comments below. Let us know where you're joining us from and if you've been to one of these before or not. All right. Excited to get started. Let you know that this is a live Q&A, so I'm going to be answering questions as much as I can in real time. You might notice I'm in a slightly different environment here. This is a new room in a new house that I've just moved into, and we're in the midst of building out a nice soundproofed, even larger studio than before in this place. So this is my temporary office / studio. Since then, you can see now my acoustic panels aren't even all up yet. Excited to start answering your questions. Make sure to type your questions in the chat down below, and I'll get to them. The focus today is mastering. I know that some of you have snuck in not from the mastering course, so if you ask some mixing questions, I'll get to those too, but I'll give priority to the mastering questions for this Mastering Demystified live Q&A. Jonathan writes in to say, I bought the course and it's helped me a lot. Great to hear, Jonathan. Are you Mastering Demystified students, or do you do the mixing breakthroughs one? Fareed, who's joining us from Morocco, asks, hello, and thanks for your videos and your works. I have a question. I noticed in my mixes, I have sometimes low mid to high or high mid. Do I have that correct, or do I let the mastering engineer do it? Let me see if I can read that one again to see if I understand. I have a question. I noticed my mixes, I have sometime low mid to high or high mid. Can you try to rephrase that question? Are you saying that there's a buildup of too much low mid or too much upper mid range? See if you can ask the question just with a little bit more detail, Fareed. I'm just trying to get a better wrap around my head around it. But it sounds like you're having an issue with some frequency buildup in your mixes. Should you address those in mixing, or should you address them in mastering? I'm going to answer that question generally first, and then depending on what other info you give me, maybe we can go a little bit deeper. But the general answer is, ideally, your finished mixes sound like mastered mixes. And you do whatever it takes to make it so that the mastering engineer's job is redundant, and hopefully you'll make me embarrassed to charge you money. That is what you want ultimately out of your mastering engineer. And you want to have that mindset every step of the way. So if you're doing a great job recording and producing, you want to do such a great job recording and producing that the mixing engineer is ashamed that he has to charge you, or that she has to charge you. Every step along the way, you should be seeking to make things sound like a finished record. And it's not uncommon at all to have buildup in the low mids in particular for a lot of the mixers, and occasionally in the upper mid, slightly bright, harsh sounding mixes. And there's two ways to address this. Well, three ways really. The first is when you're tracking, that you're trusting your listening environment so much that every single new sound that you're recording sounds appropriate, and that you've done listening in your room, in your environment, so that you know what good sounding drums should sound like, so that if you're getting drums that sound too boxy, you're correcting that hopefully at the source while you're recording. You're getting guitars that sound too aggressive, too annoying, that you're correcting that at the source. And the same thing then at the mix stage, that if you're having a lot of things that have a lot of lower mid-range buildup, that you're carving things out there at the mix, not waiting for the mastering engineer to do it, and so on. Now, there's two ways to do that. So this is why I'm saying there's three ways. There's first way is get right the source. There's two ways to do it in the mix. One is instrument by instrument, and one is at the bus level. And I generally recommend, if you take the course Mixing Breakthroughs, one of the things that I've gleaned from studying some of the best mixers in the business for the past decade is that a lot of the mix what almost seems like is a backwards way of mixing for those of us when we're just starting out. A lot of us, when we're just starting out, we think in a track by track way. We have these multi-tracks. So I'm going to open up the kick drum, spend an hour trying to get that to sound right. And now here's the snare. I'm going to spend a half an hour on that. And now here's the overheads. And now I'm going to get onto the bass. They often work the other way around, where they set their level balances first, and then they pretty immediately go into bus processing. And that might mean a master bus that has a little bit of compression and maybe even a little bit of EQ on it. If everything was recorded fairly dark, maybe they're sucking out a little bit of 450 hertz or 400 hertz or 280 hertz in the low mids right there. Maybe they're adding a little bit of 10K and up, or a tiny little bump around 5K or whatever it is. Just subtle little things to get everything going in the final direction from the start, right there on their mix bus. And if they're not confident enough to be doing a little tiny bit of EQ on their mix bus, maybe they're doing it on a bus by bus level. So a lot of the heavy lifting of EQing drums is happening on the drum bus rather than each individual element. A lot of the heavy lifting of EQing vocals or guitars or keyboards is on the respective buses for those elements. And then once we have those things established, going back to individual tracks. But yes, you should be in the mix stage trying to make the mastering engineer redundant by doing whatever you can in your power to make things sound as finished as possible. If that means carving out low mids on a lot of things, that can be a big part of mixes for a lot of people. Because generally, most of the time, new mixes are going to sound a little dark and a little boxy and a little woofy and a little mid-rangey compared to where a mastering engineer would take it. So that is something you can focus on your mixes. Some mixers will have the opposite problem, where things will sound a little bright, a little harsh, a little annoying. I would say it's like 3 or 4 out of 5 times the new mixes are a little bit dark and boxy and woolly, and they should be doing more cutting of mid-range and maybe a little bit more of low frequency roll-off. But there's that other 1 or 2 out of 5 times that things are a little bright, a little bit annoying in the upper mid-range, where we're looking to do the exact opposite. But yes, those are things you should be looking to address in the mix, and references are going to help you tune into that. We can talk more about referencing. All right, let's keep on going through. There's a lot of great stuff coming in. I'm going to try to get to some more of these questions, and I'll kind of get through them in the order that they came in. Let's see here. We got some more nice hellos here. Danielle says she's been listening to some of her new tracks that she laid down with one of her bands. It sounds great. That is great to hear. I got to hear more stuff that you've been working on, Danielle. Feel free to send some stuff over. If I'm lucky, maybe I'll help you with some mastering one of these days. Jonathan says, hopefully you make the Spanish versions of these tutorials someday. You know, I've had requests recently to do these in Italian a couple of times, and it's been a while since I got a Spanish request, but I'd love to do some Spanish language versions of these. It's a little tricky because, you know, I'm so big on the theory aspect of it that would we dub it? Let me know, would you prefer dubbing, or would you prefer subtitles, or have someone else deliver the entire course in Spanish who's an engineer? All right. I get hugs from Barcelona from Sebastian. Always good to see you here, Sebastian. Danielle from Lexington, good to see you here. Darko joining us from Slovenia. Very cool. Jonathan is here for the first time. Let's see if I can find some more questions here. Oh, Don's joining us from Nova Scotia. I've never been to here. It's gorgeous. Danielle says, new room. What a great chance to make new videos about a setup. You know I'm doing it, Danielle. We're going to have a friend of mine, an acoustic designer from a place called Sandus, help me from scratch build this room out. I'm going to be doing some video interviews with him about the build. We're going to take photos of the place. We're going to do before and after. And I hope to do a little maybe 3-part series on building out my room that hopefully you guys can learn some stuff from and get some great principles from. Danielle says, Mastering Demystified is great. I've learned so much from it. I honestly don't have a lot of questions today. I feel so much more confident in my approach to mastering now. It's so awesome to hear. And I hope you guys feel the same way after getting through this course and maybe doing a couple of these live Q&As. The Art of Mixing asks, which are common issues you face when someone sends you a mix for mastering? Oh, great question. And I'm going to give you some of the common problems that you're going to run into and how to address them. So the problems that can arise, we started to talk about one of them, and that is maybe 3 or 4 out of 5 times, the mix will be darker than it wants to be. I would say a good majority of mixes that we'll be getting to master at my studio, and this is, I think, common across the board for people, is that there'll be a little bit too much lower mid-range buildup and maybe some awkward stuff going on in the subs or down below 100 that the mixer couldn't hear. So when it comes to lower mid-range, it is not uncommon to do a little bit of cutting somewhere between 200 and 600 hertz in one or more places in a mix that's too dark, too boxy, too mid-rangey, and needs some extra clarity. Sometimes, oftentimes, that is a more transparent and less pointed and annoying way to get some brightness and articulation and clarity out of things without making things sound harsh, is to control your lower mid-range. So looking for 1 or 2 points to cut between 200 and 600 is common. Before just going in and doing that, as a matter of course, though, of course, you have to know that that is what needs to be done, that the mix is too dark. And how do you know? Best thing is to have some references to get yourself in tune with your room, your speaker environment, and the client's tastes before you get started. Because a mix that might sound too dark to you might actually be appropriate if you heard the client's favorite records and they love these warm, woolly, full sounding records. So it's not only about getting the direction right based on getting in tune with your room right, it's also about getting in tune with the clients. So that's an absolutely big thing. The next thing I'd say is when it comes to this low end stuff, another common problem is having low end where there's too much going on below 100 hertz. Maybe they're listening on speakers that don't really reproduce a lot below 60 hertz. That's very common. Maybe there is a big hump up around 50 or 60 or 80 that they don't know about that you have to control and contain. Bringing that down could be with a low shelf to bring some of that stuff down. It could be a very gently sloping low cut filter. And it also could be a tool that I find myself using more and more these days, dynamic EQ, where we're maybe sucking down 60 hertz or 50 hertz or wherever the problem is, but only when that element hits that has too much. So this could be a common thing where someone should have probably not boosted a whole bunch of 60 hertz on the kick drum they couldn't hear, or they could have made the kick drum maybe a little less, tubby and big on bottom. And to help them, we're either sloping that stuff down or just targeting a dynamic EQ to suck down 60, but only when the kick drum hits, because we don't want that happening to the bass and all the other elements. I am inclined to first try to solve problems in the most minimal way possible. So I first will usually look for like a bell-shaped or maybe a shelving filter. And then if that isn't doing the job for me, looking at our cuts, our high pass, low cut filters. And then if that isn't really doing it, then looking at dynamic EQs. And if that isn't doing it, maybe looking at multiband compression. So those are the two most common things that a lot of mixes need. But not all mixes need that, obviously, right? Some need low end added. Some mixes are too bright. So this is the other big set of problems you'll run into, is mixes that tilt too thin and don't have as much sub-frequency information as they need. Every once in a while, I'll get the exact opposite, where there's way too little information below 100. We'll have a lot of stuff in the knocky 100 hertz region, but not enough stuff in the below 100 hertz sub-bass region. And I like to divide up into my mind, when it comes to mastering the bass, into two areas. You've got your sub-bass and you've got your upper bass. And 100 hertz is a fairly good cutoff point. We're below 100 hertz, we're talking about sub-bass. And above 100 hertz, we're talking about upper bass. And bringing those into balance. And you should be able to hear and also potentially see on some meters whether those things are out of balance. And there are records, 1 or 2 out of 5 records where I'm bringing up stuff below 60 hertz significantly because there's not as much sub information as on their favorite records. And there will be occasionally the other side of things where you have to control the upper mid-range or high frequencies. Some people will boost way too much 8K, or they have a microphone that boosts 8K on everything. So this is like an 8K happy record where we're dipping 8K or putting a dynamic EQ or a de-esser around 8K to help contain that stuff. I say 8K because that's a frequency that happens a lot, but it could be 5K, it could be 6K, it could be 9K, it could be 12K. But this is the other problem in thinner mixes where maybe we're missing some subs that you're going to want to be adding in. and maybe we have overly pronounced area in the higher frequencies, often in the upper mid-range, the high upper mid-range, or the low highs, often somewhere, say, between 5K and 12K, you'll find a problem that needs to be contained on these thinner sounding mixes. And sometimes you may need to even boost some of those woody, murky sounding low mid stuff on a thin mix. So those are the two general often problems that are happening, mixes that are generally too dark, and those are two big things to look for, whether there's too much sub energy and too much low mids, and maybe you lose some highs and upper mid range too. Or if you have mixes that are too bright, too thin, where the place that I'm starting is maybe looking at, do we have enough sub and low energy, or are we overabundant in our upper mids and low highs? So those are the two most common issues that come in. But the other set of common issues that you're going to experience are going to be mixes where there's problems with the balances, where certain elements are poking out too much. And this is where sometimes you have two choices. You either, one, kind of get heavy-handed with things like dynamic EQs and multiband compressors to try to bring down the snare drum, or use an advanced tool like the isotope master rebalance that's an ozone 9 and above. We're trying to bring down vocals or bring up vocals or bring down drums or bring up drums using this master rebalance tool that isotope ozone has. I don't know, are there other companies out there that have tools like that that you guys would recommend? I do use the ozone master rebalance occasionally. The most frequent reason is to bring up vocals just a dB or two, or occasionally, rarely to bring down vocals, occasionally to bring up drums or down drums. That's less common. But I have found that with that master rebalance tool from Isotope, that one of the biggest problems of vocals being a bit too quiet and sometimes a bit too loud compared to references, I can often just tweak that as if I had stems with that master rebalance tool, but bring things up or down a hair. Other elements are trickier, and you can really dig in with dynamic EQs, multiband compression, things like this isotope tool. But at a certain point, you might need to get in touch with the client and say, here's the best that I could make this. But your mix would turn out way better, I think, if you revisited the kick drum or the hi-hat. The hi-hat's a little too loud throughout. So those are some elements that are often the elements that are most likely to be unbalanced, I've found, is kick drum being too loud or too quiet, vocal being too loud or too quiet, hi-hat being too loud or too quiet, or other cymbals, and then less frequently snare drum or some other incidental elements. And then that's the other issue, when there's balance problems. And you can try your best targeting with mid-side techniques, dynamic EQ, multiband compression, advanced tools like master rebalance. But at a certain point, I think it makes sense to coach the client a little bit, and in a very diplomatic way, where you say, hey, sounds great. Lead with, here are all the things that were awesome. If you get the sense that they're newer and open to feedback, say, here's how far I could take it. I think you're going to like a lot better. I tried to improve this, that, and the other thing. But I think that it could, if you thought it wasn't all the way there and you want to go even further, the one thing I think could be different would be if you fix this. And hopefully that's just one or two things. So I think those are some of the most common issues you run into: too dark, too bright level issues. And there's a lot of nuance within those, as you can tell, because I just talked about it for like 10 minutes. Am I going too long, or is this useful for you guys? Let me know if you want me to be a little less long-winded. Jonathan Denart says, do you brick wall, high cut, low cut in mastering? That's a good question. I think what you're asking is, do we use low cuts and high cuts with a very steep slope? Right? Is that basically the question? Like, I would say 48 decibels per octave is a really steep slope compared to, say, having a low cut with a very gentle slope, like 6 dB per octave. And the answer, of course, is it depends, right? As things often are. It depends on what I'm trying to do. So you can have one of two problems that you're trying to address with a low cut filter. One is way too much low frequency content below a certain point, in which case you're going to go steeper and steeper because you're really trying to target this cut just to 30 hertz and below, because there's something messy going on in this upright bass at just at 30 hertz and below, or 35 hertz and below, or 40 hertz and below. And this upright bass is doing a weird thing down there. Or there's a synth bass that just has way too much stuff on it, or a kick drum that has too much going on, or there's spilkus going on in a piano singer-songwriter thing. There's not supposed to be low frequency elements, and there's all this rumble going on below 50. And in these cases, you might want to use something steeper to really make sure you're eliminating that stuff below a certain point and leaving everything else untouched. The other reason you might be using a low cut filter is because you have too much low frequency more generally below in the low end. And it's not just about getting rid of the stuff 35 hertz and below, it's that you have too much low end overall. And the great thing about a slow sloping, like 6 dB per octave roll off, is that it will also affect frequencies above the roll off point. So if we have too much low end generally, maybe then you're going for anywhere from say 30 to 60 hertz, wherever it ends up. 60 would be very high. Maybe more commonly 30, 35, 40, maybe 45, maybe 50. But using a 6 dB per octave roll, a very gentle, slow sloping roll off, is going to bring down your low frequencies more generally, including above that point. So if you put it at 45 hertz and it's a gentle slope, it might also be diminishing stuff that's slightly above 45 hertz. It's diminishing stuff below 45 hertz even more, but it's not doing it super steeply. So it almost works like a shelf on steroids. And that's kind of the way I like to think about a very gentle slope, 6 dB per octave or 12 dB per octave, something like this. It's almost like a shelf on steroids. I'm looking for it to do a shelfy thing that gets more and more pronounced as it goes along. Whereas a hard stop is really because there's a specific problem below a certain area, the things above that are fine, and we want to have a quick cut there. So both of those could be used depending on what the problem is. Hope that works for you. All right. Andre asks, we are live. Yes, we're live. Darko says, I bought your mixing breakthrough and mastering bundle. What course should I buy to be in the mastering Q&As? Oh, you are in the mastering Q&As. I sent an email to everyone who's bought the bundle. It should have come to you yesterday, and it should have come to you again today. It would have gone to whatever email we have on file. And sometimes people will buy the course with a different email than is their best email. Maybe use your PayPal email. It's not your regular email. So try to look for that email in your inbox and just reply to me and say, hey, could you change my email in the mailing list to this email, you know, if you're not getting these. And then I can be absolutely sure it's going to the right email. There's a chance it could have gone to your spam folder. These emails do come from Justin@sonicscoop.com. If you're looking in your spam and your updates and your promotions and you're not finding it there, then just email me at Justin@sonicscoop.com with your preferred email address for these notices, and I'll make sure you get the monthly notices if you're in those courses. Darko says, hi to Andre. It's so great when people get to know each other right here in the comments. I absolutely love it. Sebastian says, every song has its own personality. What is usually your go-to chain when you master a song? Great question. The best I can tell you is things that I frequently use. I almost always use an EQ when I'm mastering, right? The EQ that I most frequently use as a general EQ is the isotope ozone EQ. Comparable EQs to this would be like the Fab filter EQ, is equally great. A general EQ that has a frequency analyzer in it, I find that visual feedback helpful to help me target in exactly where I want to be. And generally transparent and gives me a lot of flexibility, a lot of different curves. I use the isotope ozone as that generalist EQ most of the time. And then other people like the Fab filter, every brand seems to have that style of EQ, something like it. Well, maybe not every brand, like Plug-in Alliance and UAD don't focus as much on that stuff, but I think you can get the sonic stuff from UAD that's similar. Anyway, there's options. But in addition to that, I might use a color EQ sometimes. And my favorite one lately has been the Better Maker from Plug-in Alliance. If you guys look up Better Maker, Colletti, or something like that, or Better Maker with my name, you'll find a demo that I did for them on it, where I master a song like in real time, and I just start playing around with the Better Maker and take it to a totally different place really fast. And I really like that one as a more color EQ. And it's basically a Pultec EQ that doesn't sound as vintagey as a Pultec. So I can get the Pultec EQ kind of curves without the Pultec EQ kind of tube sound and saturation and color, which I like because then I'm going to use separate saturation plugins. So that's number one is a good general purpose kind of visual GUI EQ, like the isotope ozone one, but there's so many other options, the sonic stuff, the fab filter stuff, etc. And then maybe a Pultechy style non-visual feedback EQ that's more of a color EQ that gets me in the mode of turning knobs instead of looking at graphs. And I might use one of those where I feel like the low end really needs some reshaping and I don't want to see what I'm doing. Then a Pultechy thing like the Better Maker or more standard Pultechy EQ can be a lot of fun in helping to reshape the low end and the high end in an intuitive, fun, trying it and turning the knobs whichever way and not getting that visual feedback in your eyes that tells you you're doing everything wrong and you're not supposed to push things that far. And then on top of that, a dynamic EQ is a very useful tool for me. I would say that I've been using a dynamic EQ in lieu of a de-esser or a multiband compressor most of the time these days because I find them to be a little bit more transparent. And the one that I use there again is Isotopes Ozone's dynamic EQ. There are so many other good ones. Again, this is an area where any brand that makes a good dynamic EQ, and Fab Filter is one that a lot of people mention, they're kind of interchangeable and you just find a GUI that you really like working with that has the features that you want. And for me, the Ozone one has been fine. Then we come to compression. And this is where there's a lot of variation. And I will tell you that one of my favorite things that I got for myself was the Plugin Alliance subscription bundle because there's so many different tasty compressors in there. And I have like a library of sounds in my head where it's like, oh, this one wants an SSLE style compressor. And I love the Plugin Alliance Townhouse compressor for that. It doesn't have to be the Plugin Alliance Townhouse compressor, but it's good to have an SSL style compressor in the arsenal for that. For when like a kind of rockier track that really demands an SSL kind of thing that they didn't really do enough of at the mix level, like that I want to have handy. It depends on what kind of music you work on. If you work on a lot of guitar-y rock music, you might use that SSL compressor more often. If you work on a lot of electronic and hip hop, maybe that SSL bus compressor doing the main lifting isn't the thing. So I would say I use an SSL bus compressor, maybe 20, 30% tracks that I work on, but it's not the norm. What would be much more normal for me would be something like Manly Varimu is a plugin that not plugin, I actually use a real piece of hardware at Joe Lambert Mastering for a long time when I want something that would really fatten things up, give a little bit of girth. And I often, that would be my go-to compressor for when I run a really slow attack time to let through a lot of attack and a fairly fast release time to bring up a lot of liveliness. So other options, if you don't have a Manly Varimu compressor, or any type of like Fairchildy or tube or mu compressor with a variable attack and release preferably. So that kind of family of compressors that can get slow and sludgy if you want it to be, or can be tubey but adding excitement with a slow attack and a fast release. That could be something that I use. Another one that I like to use a lot is the Shadow Hills compressor from the Plugin Alliance bundle. Again, it's a dual compressor, an optical and discrete. But that's the place where I really do a lot of different options. You've heard me say when it comes to EQ, when it comes to dynamic EQ, often Isotope Ozone is the thing I'll use. Fill in the blank for whatever stock ones you want there. But the compressor is where I'm really looking for different colors from the compressor itself. It might have its own tone, like the Varimu does, like the Shadow Hills does, like a Pultec might, like an SSL might. But where I'm also looking for the slow and fast, am I going for a slow attack to bring out attack? Am I going for a fast attack to smooth out the initial impact? Or am I doing a little bit of both and using a little bit of each? I'll tell you that at Joe Lambert Mastering, we had two compressors in the rack that I used all the time. One was a Maselect compressor that was one of the most transparent compressors you ever hear. And I often use that when I want really fast attack to smooth out the attack. And I often use the Varimu when I wanted a slower attack to bring out more attack. And sometimes I'd use them in conjunction with each other, smoothing out the initial impact and getting more consistency out of, say, live drums and live performances with that very fast Maselect compressor. Then going into the slower attack settings on the Varimu that would bring that attack back up. So I talk about this a lot in the course and on these Q&As, the idea of occasionally needing to smooth out your attacks on generally organic live played stuff This isn't coming up as often on electronic stuff. It's more on real life instruments that you're smoothing off the attack to get things more consistent, but you don't want to dull things up. So then bringing back that attack with a slow attack compressor. Ideally, you just need one compressor. It's either going to be a fast attack one or a slow attack one, but sometimes when you need to dig in more, that combination of both is helpful. Then after that in my chain, I will often have, after the EQ, the 1 or 2 compressors. And sometimes I might use a more kind of plain compressor. I've even occasionally used the ozone compressor just because there's a lot of flexibility and you can use it in multi-band mode. If I want a multi-band compressor, I'll often use that one. MIC DSP makes some great ones. There's a whole bunch of great multi-bands out there and super flexible compressors out there. But after all that stuff, then I'm usually hitting my saturation after the compression. And I feel like it's important to hit the saturation after the compression because I kind of want generally the same amount of saturation throughout the track, and getting the dynamics controlled first before we hit the saturator makes it a little bit more consistent. And there's a lot of different saturators you could use. There's a lot of great ones in the Plug-in Alliance bundle. Like there's the new Neold one, it's like a Telefunken style one. There's the Black Box, but there's great saturators from all sorts of companies. Waves makes great ones. UAD makes great ones. The tape simulators that they have, that kind of stuff can be wonderful. And I will occasionally also use the Ozone tape simulators. They have a nice vintage tape one, and they also have their Exciter, which lets you flip through a few different modes. And this is, again, an area where I might try a lot of different brand things. This is the more interchangeable area where I want to get the right type of saturation tone. And to find the right type of saturation tone, I might put on too much saturation and flip through a bunch of different models to sound this is a great way to get saturation. Put in too much saturation, flip through a bunch of them and say, if we wanted to put on way too much saturation, this is the right sounding saturation. The tube one, the triode one, the tape one, this time it's the oxide from Universal Audio, whoever it is. Put on a little bit too much, get it sounding awesome, but obviously too much, and then dial that back. Maybe by turning down the mix dry wet knob, maybe by jacking up the input less, or maybe a little bit of both, that kind of thing. And then after that, I will usually go to some type of stereo widener. Some great tools there. The one I often use here, I'm going to say Ozone again. I feel cheesy that I often use the Ozone EQ, dynamic EQ, and their widener. Those are the 3 most common things I would use from Ozone. There are other good wideners, Plug-in Alliance, the Brainwork stuff. They have cool stuff in there where you have a mono maker where you can make things more mono in the bottom end, or you can spread things out above that point. And that's one of the things I like about the Ozone one is it's the most flexible and that's a multi-band spreader. And I will very often use widening selectively above a certain frequency, I guess from your perspective, above a certain frequency would be that way. And then often making things more mono below a certain frequency. That could be anywhere from like 60 hertz to 200 hertz is where I might set the point where things below that get actually more narrow and things above that get more wide. And then sometimes I might want to add an additional band where maybe the top end isn't quite as wide as the mid-range, or maybe the lower mid-range isn't quite as wide as the slightly higher stuff. So every once in a while, I could end up with 3 or 4 bands, and the Ozone one allows me to do that. But sometimes 2 bands is enough. So that'll be the Imager there. A lot of other brands make stuff like that. That happens to be the one that I use the most often. And then after that, the limiter. What limiter do I use? They each have their own tone. There's some Brainworks limiters that I like a lot. The Ozone limiter I like a lot. I've liked the Massey limiter quite a bit. Sometimes the Waves L2 is the right sound. Very rarely do I use the Pro Tools Maxim because I think that one sounds very bright to me, but every once in a while, it's like I need more excitement and brightness out of this, and the Maxim will do that thing. So that's kind of a look at the common stuff in my digital chain. EQ, dynamic EQ. I should preface this by saying I'll often put the dynamic EQ before the EQ because I don't want moves that I'm making in my EQ affecting the settings in the dynamic EQ and the thresholds there. So I should actually reiterate this for you. The dynamic EQ is likely to come first, then EQ. then into a compressor, and this is where I'm more likely to choose through a variety of different things, then into an exciter, saturator, and this is another area where I'm likely to try through a lot of different things, then through a stereo width tool. My default there is the Ozone one, although there are other brand stuff that do a great job that I'll often use sometimes. Sometimes I prefer the sound of the Brainwork stuff. And then the limiter. And that's another place where I'll often try a few things. The Ozone one is cool again because it allows you to flip through a bunch of stuff, but I really like the sound of a whole bunch of other brands, limiters, particularly the Brainwork stuff. The Brainworks, actually, they have like a 4-band limiter that I'll use sometimes that I really like. And like on a hip hop track where I want to limit the lows separately than other stuff, I really like that multi-band limiter from Brainworks, but Waves makes a great multi-band limiter, as does MicDSP and others. UAD, I think, has one. So that's another idea there. Wow, another deep, long answer there. I hope that's helpful for you. Do you have any additional questions? Again, am I going too long, or is this stuff good for you? All right, next question here. Shauna agrees about A/B referencing. Super important in mastering. You got to get tuned into both your room, your body, your speakers, and your client's tastes early on in the beginning. What are some good references of well-mastered songs? Oh my goodness, that's a great question. Well, it's hard to tell what's well-mastered versus just well-recorded, produced, and mixed, right? Because we don't know which one of those things did the most. So your favorite references are the best mastered songs. It's hard to say, was the mastering the thing that made it sound that great, or did the mastering engineer barely do anything because the mix engineer did? So that's hard to answer. So the best I could answer is, what are good references in general for beautiful sounding music? And that's personal choice for you. And it's a personal choice for your clients. So the two best references are let me back that up, 3. There's 3 types of ideal references. 1, stuff that you just think sounds absolutely gorgeous and you love the sound of. 2, stuff that is revealing and reveals problem areas that's specifically tailored for you to get in tune with your space and get in tune with how a certain frequency area should sound. And I can give you some examples of those for me, and those should be personal to you. And 3rd, those that are going to get you in tune with your client and your client's tastes. And those can be references they provide to you as the ideal, but also going through iTunes and Spotify and hearing what's at the top of the charts in their genre without them even telling you, and the stuff that you love the most in their genre or style, that can be really valuable. You want specific recommendations though. Okay. I will give you the number 2 one, the things that identify specific issues for me or get me in tune in a specific way. So there's a track I've been using for a long time that I love listening to. I've heard it in so many spaces, and this is an esoteric track I'm going to throw out to you. It's called Elephant Woman by a band called Blonde Redhead off a record called Misery is a Butterfly. I think it's a gorgeous sounding record. It's a weird and esoteric reference that I don't expect most of you guys to know, even the blonde band Blonde Redhead. But that song Elephant Woman I like for a few reasons. One, it has this super pinched, nasally, radio-y kind of thing going on in the vocal, like this really pinched forward mid-range thing in the vocal that can get me a sense for how these speakers speak in the mid-range. And it has some interesting stuff going on, especially in the intro, with a fast kick pattern that has a lot of sub on it. And that kick is really driven by 40 and 50 hertz. So it can give me a sense of how 40 and 50 hertz are responding in the room, what 40 and 50 hertz should sound like in that room. So if I go from one room to another, like it has this weird thing that's not in a lot of tracks down there that lets me hear what's the speaker doing down low, what's the room doing down low, and just refreshing my memory on what that track sounds like. Another track that does a similar thing for me, this is another esoteric one. It's not necessarily the most gorgeous track, although it's a very pretty track, by a band called Air, the French band Air. It's a track called Le Femme d'Argent. It's off of their first record, Moon Safari, I think is the opening track. And if you hear it, you've almost certainly heard this track before, even if you don't know the band. It's probably played at some lounge or bar or club you've been at some point in the background. It has this really interesting, iconic bass line that goes throughout the whole thing. And that bass, it sits in this like 70, 80 hertz range. And like, I know how it sounds on that record because I've heard it in so many spaces, and it lets me hear what's going on in that area. So those are two examples of like a track that isn't necessarily meaningful to the world because it's not supposed to be. They're tracks that are meaningful to me because one tells me a lot about 40 and 50 hertz and also about the mid-range. One tells me a lot about, 60 to 90 hertz and how that sounds. And I can go from place to place and I can get retuned with my speakers. And I've just heard them so many times. So I come back to them again and again. That's one type of reference. But then there's other types of references where, you just think they're great within that genre. Like, I don't know how you could not like the song Uptown Funk, by, was it Mark Ronson and Bruno Mars? I mean, that's the song where like everyone dances when it comes on at the wedding, even the people don't like to dance. It's a great production. It feels a little bit like Thriller or something. It has so much attack, and when it came out, it felt so refreshing that like someone was bringing attack back into music. And like when something is in that kind of funky vibe, and like it should have a lot of attack, like that's something I want to get in my ear, as that's what like that style at its best sounds like. So you want some tracks like that where it sounds like that style at its best. But there's other things, like this is an esoteric reference, a band called Talk Talk. They have this record In Rainbows. It starts with this harmonica thing and this gorgeous reverb. And, for something that's really slow and syrupy and trippy, like that's just a gorgeous sounding record, and getting that into my ears. Or Beck's Sea Change, maybe. Not even one of my favorite Beck records, but gorgeous, mastered by Bob Ludwig. Some of the string stuff, the song Paper Tiger in particular by Beck, that's a great one for, man, how big and wide and bulbous and rich can we go if we want to go in that direction. But a great reference might be a totally blown out hip hop track, or a totally blown out Major Lazer track, or, Skrillex track that sounds ideal for its genre, that sounds like, man, this is some of the most impressive stuff in this genre. But even more important than any of those things is number 3, getting in tune with what your clients really want to hear out of the record. All right, that was another somewhat lengthy, but hopefully useful answer. Let's keep on going through. Jonathan asks, what EQ plugins do you recommend for mastering? I think I've gone through that. A general purpose one that is super flexible, like Ozone, like the Fab Filter, etc., is a great thing to have. A dynamic EQ is a great thing to have. And potentially maybe like a Pultecchi or other, what your preferred type of character EQ that you really like using. Could be a good thing. Plugin Alliance came out the new one recently, the AMEC EQ 200. That's a super cool one for like going for like a more retro style. I'm not looking at things and I'm just listening kind of feel. So I think those would be the 3 categories: your Swiss Army knife, your dynamic EQ, and your more vintagey style color and shaping EQ. Let's get another question. Shauna asks, I like to have vocals dry on the sides, but only put vocal with reverb in mono. Cool, yeah, that could be a cool thing to do. And maybe you're talking about the difference between, this is common, having a somewhat wetter lead vocal with somewhat drier backgrounds is sometimes an interesting approach. The reverse sometimes happens too, obviously, with the dry lead vocal and wetter backgrounds. But that's a fun thing to play around with. The depth and front to back relationship of leads as opposed to background or side or fill vocals, and how to give them a little bit of separation and space and put them in slightly different worlds while still feeling like they belong in the same record and not too disjointed. And that's a balance that you're constantly learning to strike, is how to give us contrast between the lead and background vocals, or center and side vocals, while not giving them so much contrast that they feel like they belong in different records. Danielle says the rebalance in the new RX-8 is a lot smoother. Got to try it out. I've not upgraded my RX-7 to RX-8, but I hear good things. So I'm going to do these guys will send it to me if I write to them. I have a good relationship with those guys. Why have I not asked them for it yet? Because I'm silly. Thank you for pushing my buttons, Danielle. I'm going to go get myself RX-8 and try it out. Art of Mixing asks, what do you think about mid-side EQ on mastering? Cutting the lows up to 120 to 150 on the sides. What do you think about it? I do it sometimes. Not as a matter of course. It's a, you hear it when you need it kind of thing, but it is absolutely a valid technique. How often do I do it? I don't know. 20% of the time, 10% of the time, I'm not sure. Somewhere between 10% and 30% of the time, right? Less than a majority, less than half of the time, I'm listening to the mix and I will say, things are a little bit too thick and bottomy on the sides. I want to maybe even amp up the bottom in the center, but really get rid of it on the sides. Or, man, when I try to bring down, I know the lows need to come down on this record. There's too much lows, but when I bring down the lows overall, something's not working. Oh, but when I bring down the lows just on the sides, that gives me what I need. I'm taking down the lows without removing that impact from the center bottom where I want it. So totally valid technique. And like I said, it'll often happen because I consciously hear that there's too much low end just on the sides, or whatever I'm trying with getting rid of the low end overall isn't working. And then this more subtle approach to getting rid of some of the low end just on the sides turns out to be more effective, but totally valid. And yes, it could be that high. It could be 120 to 150 because most of the time there shouldn't be elements that have a lot of stuff below 100 hertz that have a lot of information in the sides. Those things usually, your super low frequencies should be totally monocompatible. So absolutely, yeah, totally valid, totally a cool thing to do when you need to do it. I wouldn't do it as a default. I'd listen for it as a possible technique to implement. And when it sounds like it could be the right thing, give it a try and then see how you like it. Danielle says you can make AI stems in the new RX. Yes, I've heard and seen this demonstrated. I love the idea of it. Definitely want to try it out. Sometimes people who do this like day in and day out, have been doing it a long time, get stuck with their old tools because like it's like if it ain't broken, don't fix it kind of thing. And there are people, I'm not trying to say like I'm the most experienced guy and I'm more experienced than, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying there are people who I know who are way more experienced than me that I'll try new tools quicker than them because they're like, this is working for me. Like Jimmy Douglas, when we did an interview with him, he was using a couple generations back of a bunch of plugins. He's like, this one works. Why do I need a new one? And like, I'm in my groove. And there is some validity to that. So I have to say, upgrading and changing tools doesn't happen that often for me. And then I finally do it and I'm like, oh, I'm glad I did that. So something to definitely do, keep up with new stuff as it comes out, but you don't always have to do it minute one necessarily if that's distracting you from just doing great work. Tommy from Norway at Solisma Studio says, is it really such a bad idea to put a mastering chain on the mix bus while mixing? No, it's not such a bad idea. Even if it sounds really good and right for a specific song, it depends maybe. Maybe you wrote this before I gave my opening spiel, or maybe you missed it, but my opening spiel was, yes, treat your mix bus. Learn to treat your mix bus. Compress, maybe even EQ, maybe a tiny touch of limiting. I wouldn't focus on doing that stuff just to make things loud so much, but yes, if you're mixing through a compressor, a limiter, an EQ, and it gets you to the right place, even a hint of stereo widening, great, do it. I will warn you, however, the only way you get really good at that is by occasionally doing it badly. So do too much and then back off. I had someone not too long ago send me a mix where they widened out the low end below like 200 hertz by like 90% on like the ozone widener. And I heard this track and I was like, as nice as I could, I was like, here's the best I could take. I want to tighten up the low end a little bit to sound a lot wider and more spread out than a lot of your favorite mixes. So here are the things I try to do to center it more. Is there a chance that you added anything on the, the master bus that may have widened things out? Maybe a little more than necessary. Maybe we could tuck that stuff back. And he sent me photos of the screen caps. If he actually had 2 stereo widening plugins on it, both of which were doing a bunch of widening, and one, the ozone, which was used particularly in the low end to widen things out like crazy. And it was a kind of cool and interesting sound in a way, but it was totally different than all the references and all the records this person loved the sound of. So I said, you know what, just take that off completely. And I'll give it a shot. And I think that helped and made it sound a lot better. So there is the possible issue of overdoing it. And this is why people will tell you, don't mess around with this stuff on your mix bus because you could ruin it. It's like, yeah, true, you could ruin it. You could ruin your kick drum by putting an EQ on your kick drum like you're supposed to. You could ruin your vocal by putting a reverb on your vocal. You could ruin anything at any time in any mix. So you eventually got to learn how to use this stuff, and you got to learn how to use it by trying it and maybe by pushing things a little bit too far and too hard. And a good trick is to push things a little too hard and then back off, or give yourself license to try things, you know? I would say that it's good to err on the side of being subtle as you're still learning how this stuff works, but you've got to occasionally push things way too hard. And this is actually going to be my podcast episode next week. It's about exactly this idea of how do you strike that balance between being safe and conservative and not overdoing it on your mix bus and ruining your mix that way, but also learning how this stuff really sounds so you can be a little bit less conservative. Because the only way you're going to learn how this stuff sounds is by overdoing it. And you're only ever really going to learn how compression sounds or limiting sounds or saturation sounds by overdoing it. And there's two ways to do that. One is when you're dialing things in, dial in too much compression, too much saturation, too much EQ, too much reverb to where you know it's a bit too much, and then back off to where you think it's not too much, and then back off a little bit more. And that will give you the exercise of hearing these things at their extreme so you can understand what they sound like when they're too much and they go on too strong and too far. Give yourself the license of pushing things too far just to hear what they sound like, and then dialing them back, and then dialing them back a little bit more. And as you gain confidence through that, then you're going to be able to more immediately know how far you should push things. Another way is to give yourself concerted practice time when you're not really trying to get a final mix for the client or a final master for the client, but you're just playing around and you're like, I'm sitting down today to learn what all of my saturators sound like. I'm sitting down today to learn what the difference between fast attack compression and slow attack compression sound like. I'm sitting down today to learn what the difference between a fast release and a slow release sounds like. I'm sitting down today to limit too much and learn what all my limiters sound like. I'm sitting down today to use too much reverb so that I can identify blindfolded which one's a chamber, which one's a plate, which one's a spring, etc. So to give yourself that time outside of doing work, where you can play around and experiment with going too hard, because that's how you're going to gain the confidence to use just the right amount in your mix bus. Hope that makes sense. Man, we're getting close to 3 o'clock here. We did start a few minutes late, so we're going to go a few minutes over, but these are great questions and I'm having a lot of fun answering them. Thanks for sticking with me. All right, Danielle says, I've realized I'm happier using buses to mix things like compression, saturation, and maybe a taste of the inflator. It may not be traditional, but I love the way it can sound. I run through the Shadow Hills just to get a taste of circuits, but the majority of compression comes from the buses. Yeah, Danielle, you're doing things that they tell you is wrong in the textbooks and the magazines, but if you talk to like pretty much every pro who's doing it at a high level, they actually do. So I don't know if it's not that traditional. It's traditional among people who know what they're doing and get great sounding records, and it's not traditional among people who are your college professors and journalists. This is funny. I get to make fun of college professors and journalists because I've been both. All right, let's go on here. Andre says, I hear a bird plugin. Oh, do you hear birds in the background here? Well, that's a tweeter. We have pet birds, and sometimes they like to land on a pair of speakers of mine, and I'd have to immediately get them off so they wouldn't poop on our speakers. And I would always say to them, hey, no tweeters on tweeters. That's like a terrible dad joke, but it's true. Let's see. Shauna says, I have to admit my biggest mistake is to remove too much warmth in the vocals in order to fit the vocal into the mix, when I should instead have EQ'd the instruments. Whoa, that is like some amazing self-awareness, and that is totally a thing that I hear in people's mixes happen often when they're starting out. I think it's a brilliant observation, and knowing is half the battle. They say knowing is half the battle to make you feel really good about knowing, but then there's the other half of the battle. Just the remembering and the implementing and the doing. So good luck with the other half, but you're through half of the battle. It's huge, and that's a great thing to realize if you're doing. Sebastian says, for the mids, my reference is No One Knows from Queens of the Stone Age. Great. For subs, Massive Attack Protection. Yes, it's old, but it works. fantastic references. As soon as you bring those records up, I know exactly what they sound like in my ear. And I could totally see why those would be great references for you personally. Makes a lot of sense. Danielle helped beta RX8. That's so awesome. We've got super cool, important people in our chats every week. Makes me smile whenever I see Danielle's icon in there. Sebastian says, second question, Justin, do you apply parallel compression to the master with distortion or a compressor? Or do you parallel process with distortion or a compressor? Absolutely, most particularly with saturation. I find that one of the best ways to get saturation in mastering, possibly in general, but particularly in mastering, is to use too much saturation, flip through a bunch of them, figure out which one sounds the coolest when it's obviously too much, and then dial it back. And there are two ways to dial it back. One is by dialing back the drive, the amount, and the other is to dial back the percentage. And I often find myself doing both of those, and probably doing relatively more of the dialing back of the percentage than the drive. It really depends on the tool. Some tools don't have the option of a percentage of a mix wet dry knob. Some of the tape simulators might not always have a wet dry knob, so you're kind of using the input and then pulling back. What's a good example? You've got Isotope stuck in my head because we were talking about, I use their EQs all the time, and we're talking about RX8. So let me use their tool as a, so they have a saturator plugin where there's like 4 or 5 different types of saturation you can flip through. It's one of the good things I like about it. I think it's a great learning tool, even if it doesn't end up being the one you use on every single track. I might push up the wet dry knob to like 100%, so it's just all wet, and then push up the drive enough so that it starts being clearly too much. Where does that end up? It goes from like 0 to 15, I think, if I remember right on that one. And maybe I might need to bring it up somewhere between 5 and 12 or 6 and 12 to hear enough saturation, which is obviously too much. And then depending on that particular plugin, which one I end up on as being the right one, I might have to dial it down by a certain amount so it's not like saturating way too much. And then once I've gotten that dialed into a good place where it's like, this is clearly too much, but like kind of a good amount of saturation, where with the amount, I'm looking for like the back and forth of the saturation. Is it saturating a little bit more on heavy parts or certain instruments compared to others? Let's get to a place where it's kind of balanced, that's not too fuzzy, at 100% wet. And then I tuck it down. I say, okay, that's still too much. Let me tuck it down a little bit more. Okay, here's too much saturation, but it's within the realm of reason. And then I'll take that wet dry slider and slide it so far down. It would be rare that it ends up more than 50% wet. And sometimes it could end up at like 10% wet. It'd be very common for it to be anywhere between, like on that ozone one, anywhere between 10 and 50% wetness, with anywhere from like 1 to 5 on the drive control. So it can be fairly subtle and more felt than heard, where you're noticing a difference over long periods of time, a little bit more than you're noticing it super quick in a sip test, A being back and forth. And that kind of general approach makes sense. It's slightly less relevant on some plugins that don't have a wet dry knob. The parallel compression, I'm less likely to use in mastering. I'm more likely to use serial compression than parallel compression, but sometimes I will use parallel compression. Sometimes I'll get everything dialed in and I think it's just right, but as I'm going along, I realize I need to back off on the compression a little bit. So then I'll back off on the compression, usually first by bringing up the threshold or bringing down the ratio. But then as I'm starting to either bring up the threshold or bring down the ratio, the compressor isn't doing what I want to do anymore. It's not reacting the same way. Like it's not reacting enough to the heaviest hits, or it's overreacting to certain things. Like the way it's reacting is changing when I'm bringing up the threshold or bringing down the ratio. So I say, you know what? We had the compressor dialed in well. Let's go back. It's just too much. It's like good dialed in. I like the way the meters are moving and the way that I'm hearing it, but it's just too compressed. So now I'll back off from 100% compression down to 90% or 80% or 70% or something like that. Occasionally, though, I will do that conventional parallel compression thing. I think it's rare for me in mastering, but sometimes I'll have the wet dry knob at 20% to 40%, and then a whole ton of compression happening. And that's usually because all of my other usual tricks didn't work, and then that one worked, and I wound up there. But I'd say, for me at least, my process is less common for me to do parallel compression compared to doing serial compression. And usually when I do parallel compression, it's because I found a good compression setting, but then just wanted to back off. And then occasionally it's a more conventional, let's hyper compress, and then do that. The using wet dry decidedly in mastering, much more common for me on saturation, where I might use too much saturation and then back off significantly. What's your intention? Asked Khalib. We're past 3 here, but just some great questions. Let me see if I can get to the last few here, and then I think that's about it for new questions I can handle. I'll see if I can get through all these. We've gone over it a little bit already, but it's just so much fun chatting with you guys and getting such great questions from you. Khalib Kingston says, what is your intention when it comes to gain staging? Do you put a gain plugin on all the sounds and put them at a decent level, like -6 dB and stuff, and then set your static balance after that? This is more of a mixing specific question. So I'm sorry, Khalib, we're in the mastering course right now. I'm going to see if I can jump down to more mastering specific questions and get those knocked out. And if I have enough time, I'll see if I can come back to this one. Darko says, I'm using Grammatique Brave Men featuring Escobars as a reference to check if my song is too much bass and sub. That's great. Yes, it's great to have tracks, particularly as dedicated low-end references, particularly within a genre. Sebastian says 3 limiters that not everybody knows but deserve a try are the invisible limiter G2 from Aeon, the complete TDR limiter 6GE, and the multiband limitless from DMG. I'm familiar with the first and last one in that I've heard their names, but I have not tried them. Thanks for the recommendation. These are great tips here. I'll try to screen cap this over here. So I'm going to try them later. All right. Danielle says, oh, yay, smart and talented people do buses too. Well, come on. Now you're calling yourself not smart and talented. I think that's silly, Danielle. Andre Erlimer gives us a big smiley face. I love your smiley faces. Hopefully I said your name right. It could be Erlmeyer. Did I get it right the second time? Erlmeyer. Khalib Kingston says, after running all the drum bus and instrument buses to a mixed bus, well, I'll see if I can get back to this, Khalib. And then Danielle says, sometimes I automate the parallel buses to react to different sections. That's a great idea. Absolutely. Danielle, we'll have to have you guest teaching one of these classes one of these days. I like your approach. All right. Khalib, I'm going to try. This is our mixing question. Let me see if I can do a super quick answer. So intention to gain staging, static mix. After running down all the drum bus and the instrument buses to a mix bus, do you need a rear bus or pre-master bus? What do you feel about pink noise mixing against reference mixing? That's a separate question. Okay. I'm going to try to answer this one as best as possible. I actually answered this in a podcast episode that came out just yesterday, so I encourage you to check that out. It's called The 2 Biggest Mistakes Most New Mixers Make, or known as the 2 Biggest Mix Balance Mistakes. And I actually addressed this, but here's my recommendation for mixing, is that you start by getting rough level balances. You can do that into a bus compressor, or you can do it without a bus compressor, and then once you get your rough mix balances, put the bus compressor on. Before you do that, or while you're doing that initial static balance, where you're doing it just through a bus compressor, so it might go this way. You start the balances, you get things to do a decent rough balance, you put on the mix bus compressor, you keep on doing your rough balances, and you get to a place where it's like, I have gotten a good static balance in the most dense and important section in this song, where the most stuff is going on, and it's going to be the hardest to get this mix sounding right. Diving right into a super important, super dense section, just using faders, maybe adding on a bus compressor, continuing just using faders, got my balance dialed in, my static mix in that section. Then once you've done that, maybe now you're saying, overall, one of the big problems here is that everything is a little too dark, too bright, doesn't have enough sub, whatever. And then if you were going to put on a mix bus EQ, this might be the point where I put on a mix bus EQ to do a little bit of overall treatment. And then I might go from there to start treating all of our independent buses with getting their compressors dialed in, maybe their EQs dialed in. And then that's kind of your overall static mix. And then after that, we'd be looking at EQ and compression potentially on individual elements. And once we've kind of gotten the static mix through our mix bus compressor and then through our prior bus compressors, and then looking at the individual track level, then going out into our other sections and going through our initial macro automation, where we're saying the vocal level we set for the chorus was great, but in the verse, it's way too quiet or loud, and we're going to bring it up. The hi-hat was cool when everything was playing, it was an appropriate level, but now in this sparse verse section, it's way too loud. We don't need it to be that loud when not as many instruments are playing, so we're going to bring down that hi-hat in the verses. So we do that macro automation. And then once you're done with that macro automation pass of getting section to section changes right, doing a micro automation pass, we're really just looking at, following the vocal throughout the song. Or if you have enough faders, following the entire song and making things live and breathe a little bit more. So that would be the general overall approach. Now, I got ahead of myself because in that initial setting the static balances phase, you may find that some tracks are way too up and down and all over the place to get an appropriate balance. One way to deal with that is with compression and limiting, but to make sure that you're not doing a ton of compression and limiting, and or to make sure that your compression and limiting isn't inconsistent in that you have a ton of compression happening in the chorus when the singer's belting, but almost no compression happening in the verse when they're whispering. You might want to do clip gain. So clip gaining, going in 2 tracks and setting them to the right levels before they even hit a fader, is something that will probably emerge as you're doing your initial rough balances. You're doing your rough balances, you're getting your static mix, and then you're finding this problem crop up of, hey, I could probably go and clip gain this stuff so I'm not just using a ton of compression to make the vocal sit properly or the guitar sit properly. And then as you're going back out into other sections, you say, yes, I could be riding things, but since the verse is sung so much more quietly in the verse than in the chorus, I'm going to bring that up with clip gain before we even hit the fader, because now I'm going to be hitting my compressor in a more similar way in the verse compared to the chorus, so I'll have a little bit more dynamic consistency in the verse. So I'll play with the clip gain as like a gain staging thing before we hit our final fader. I hope that makes sense. Has this stuff been clear to you guys? We're about an hour 7 in. So I think I've got to start ending here. But Danielle says, I love limiter number 6 and it's free. So I feel like I got to try it. Khalib has one more question. What are the basic meters I should be aware of, like peak, RMS, VU? There are a lot and I'm confused a bit. Because they say peak up to 6 dB and then they say negative 18 dB of RMS and 0 on the VU meter. I get it. Okay, let's go through this real quick. This is the last question I can take, and then I got to run. It's just so much fun being with you guys here. And hopefully next month we'll see my studio a little more set up here. I don't think the full studio build and the even larger room is going to be done, but I'll probably have this place totally paneled out by then. And looking forward to seeing you guys again next month. So Khalib, the essential types of meters are 1, your general peak dBFS meter. These are usually the kind of meters you're going to see in Pro Tools or whatever other DAW. They may also be kind of RMS-y too. It's like the speed of the meter, basically. So a peak meter should be fast enough to show you what your loudest peaks are. But they may not be like pure peak meters in that they're actually looking at like momentary potentially audio. I actually went into this. Ooh, there's a new module coming out in Mastering Demystified. I just filmed it 2 weeks ago, right before I moved. I haven't edited it yet. It's going to come out next month. I go into this in great detail, and you're going to be able to see it. I bring up a plugin called Hawkeye from it's Plugin Alliance one. I think it's SPL, I think. And it's super involved, but it has LUFS metering. So you basically have 2 general ideas, right? Peak is momentary, just in the instant, how hot was it? RMS is the average over a period of time. A LUFS meter will often show you a little bit of both. And what a LUFS rating is the difference between peak and your average. But there's like 3 different ways that LUFS meter can work. This is going to be one of these things that's much better if you see it visually. So that new module is going to come out. Anyone who owns Mastering Demystified will get hip to this new module as soon as I have it edited and up. Hopefully that'll be just a week or 2 into November that you guys will have access to that new bonus module on meters and mastering, meters, levels. I talk a little about mastering from stems in it too. So the Hawkeye one is great. You can get a demo of it because you can see that in that one, they have 3 different types of LUFS. The regular LUFS, when you say something, when something is -6 on the LUFS meter, what that means is that the loudest peak that has happened in the track is only 6 dB louder than the long-term average for the entire track. So maybe the loudest peak was right there at 0 dBFS, and then the average was only at -6 dBFS. That would be a very loud master, and that's approaching the loudest that you're probably ever going to want to master, maybe in some genres of electronic and hip hop and some metal and stuff. Lower than that, in maybe -6 to -8 is common in EDM. But then lower than that would be like, say, the range of -10 would be like a pretty hot rock master, maybe, and -14 would be a fairly quiet rock master. I'd say that would be the range for like rock generally. Some of them will go louder than that. Occasionally they'll go quieter, but that's a good range, -14 to -10. And that means that now the difference between our average level and our peak is, say it's -12. We'll pick something right in the middle. There's a difference between of 12 dB between the peak and the long-term average. But that's just one type of long-range metering. That is the average level for the entire track. The SPL has one right next to it that has a what's called momentary, and that is the difference between the loudest moment and the last like half a second. I think it's 400 milliseconds. So it could be that your track is overall is 10, right? The difference of 10 between the highest peak and the average level across the whole track. But if you look at the average level just over the past 400 milliseconds, maybe it's 12 or 14. And then they'll have another meter in that SPL one called momentary, or sorry, instant. So it's just like in the past, I forget if it's like 10 milliseconds or whatever. So maybe that one's -16, right? So you could potentially have a track that was -16 LUFS in the instant, -12 LUFS in the moment, like half a second, and -10 LUFS over the entirety. So there's a variety of, and all of those are like the RMS concept, which is an average. So there's basically 3 ideas here, I think. There's the idea of peak. What's the loudest we were? Where are we this very, very instant? There's RMS, or the concept more generally of average level averaged. But then level averaged over how long is a question. And then there is the idea of a loudness meter, like a LUFS meter. And what's different about a LUFS meter is they'll generally be read out in the difference between your peak and your average is generally how LUFS is written. But there's also some shenanigans going on in the EQ curve where they don't want the contribution of low end to be too pronounced, where the LUFS meter is trying to compensate for the hearing curve of the human ear, where brighter stuff is generally going to sound louder to us at the same amplitude than darker stuff. So LUFS meter is also trying to take that into account. So there's some EQ shenanigans going on. Okay, last thing here, Danielle says, I like levels by Mastering the Mix and Ulean for metering. I will check those out too. I always love getting plugin recommendations here. And Darko says, PI Hawkeye meter is the best. I'm using it every time. Flux meter is also good. Yeah, absolutely. Guys, thanks so much for joining me. We went a little bit over, but it looks like most of you stayed the entire way. So super exciting. I guess I didn't bore you entirely to tears. Thank you again for joining me. Hope this has been useful. Look forward to that new module coming out in Mastering Demystified very shortly. So exciting to have you guys here. Kalib, I think some of your questions are being answered in my 2 most recent podcast episodes, so check those out. Thank you guys for joining me. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop, all that good stuff. We got giveaways going on at sonicscoop.com/contest if you want to check those out. Thanks again for joining me. See you next time.